Greetings. This is Tom Bankston. I'm publisher of BankBeat magazine and bankbeat.biz. We're grateful that you're joining us. This is another QuickTakes video blog. And our guest this time is Keith Leggett, a longtime economist with the American Bankers Association, retired a little over 5 years ago. And perhaps one of the areas for which he is best known is his blog, which is the Credit Union Watch. I have been a reader of that blog for years, and he is just bringing that venture to a close. And so we thought it'd be a good time to connect and get some of his thoughts. Keith, thank you for being with us.
Well, you're welcome.
I wanted to just ask you, you've been working on this credit union issue for a very long time. What would you say? What are some ways that what are the best things bankers can do to make headway on this issue? They've been bringing this issue to their elected officials and others for years without a whole lot of results, seemingly. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, that's a tough issue because one thing with the credit unions is that they're very good at mobilizing themselves with regard to grassroots. And I think that what bankers need to look at is improving their grassroots efforts going forward, but also maybe think a little differently and start looking at maybe thinking outside of the box, because a lot of the work that bankers have always done has been kind of like trying to protect their territory from credit unions encroaching into it. An interesting idea that was shared with me by Jim Blaine, who was the head of the second largest credit union in the United States. And he said, you know, actually, if you make credit unions even more like banks, it's going to be harder for them to fend off any discussion about taxation and other issues. So he talked about removing the business loan cap and, and also eliminating the field of membership restrictions would actually make it easier to make the case that credit unions should be taxed, because the credit unions can always fall back by saying, oh, we have this common bond, oh, we have this cap on our business lending, which then they can say this makes us different from banks. So that is maybe a way to look at it. You know, it's one way where you would say, let's make it a little bit sweeter for credit unions. And maybe they will think about the alternative of trading off taxation. And I think that's more likely to be the case among the largest credit unions. And so what you may want to look at is bifurcating the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious, so there is a lot of talk about that among the smaller credit unions, they're not that different from community banks, and it's really the largest credit unions that the banking industry seems to have the greatest beef with, and that's where the taxation issue is the most pronounced. Sometimes the idea gets thrown out that, well, maybe banks should be exempt, small banks should be exempt from taxation the same way credit unions are. That would put them on equal footing. Certainly you've heard that argument. What do you make of it?
Well, you know, it's an interesting argument. I think the biggest problem you have is that you have to make a compelling case to Congress as to why you should not be taxed. And one of the things you'll have to do is start talking about, all right, are we going to take on a social mission function for this tax exemption? In other words, you have to have some justification for this tax exempt status. You just can't say, don't tax us. So you need to end up saying, okay, are we going to take on a little bit more of a charitable focus?
Sure, and serving rural communities, small communities that are largely overlooked by larger financial institutions, you think maybe that's not compelling enough in and of itself?
It may have some, it may compel in some ways, but a lot of times when you find it is that you have community bankers in urban areas who would be kind of carved out and they would feel neglected, you know, if you did that.
I see. Sure. And the other issue that you hear sometimes is credit unions will say, well, we deserve a tax exemption because we can't raise capital the way banks can. We have no way of getting money if we need it. And I'm wondering if you think that's a good argument, or if there's a way around that, or how do you deal with that?
Well, one of the key things you have to realize is that most community banks rely upon retained earnings as their source of capital. They aren't able to tap the capital markets either. And also you have to consider that NCUA has this proposal out there that's going to allow credit unions to include subordinated debt, at least as capital for their risk-based capital requirements. And also, what you are going to have is our credit unions tapping the capital markets. They're going to go out and get funding from investors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
now
of course,
that may be create a dilemma for credit unions, because also now they are raising capital, and we as the industry, you can start talking about that.
yes. Yeah. And of course, we have this whole phenomenon going on now where some credit unions are buying banks. So apparently they have plenty of capital, right? If you've got enough money around to buy a bank, it sounds like capital is really not a problem. But
Well, I agree. And, and also the other way around, I've always thought that banks should also be considering buying credit unions. Even though the process is difficult, bankers should recognize that credit unions are deposit rich. And if right now you don't need deposits, but in an environment where you do need deposits, you may want to consider pursuing credit unions. And, at least the board would have to entertain the motion and potentially present it to the members. And if the members looked at a way to unlock their capital, that may be a positive.
yeah, yeah. Tell me, have you ever run into any elected officials in Congress who have said, yeah, you're right, I agree with you? Because I don't know that I found very many who are willing to, to vote with the banks on this issue.
The only time I ever encountered it is when they decided not to run for re-election.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And probably, and I don't know, given the political reality of all of this, do you ever see the playing field being leveled any more than it already is?
That's, the key argument out there is that at least with the policy side, policy folks understand the issue, and they understand that it is an uneven playing field. It really gets down to brass knuckle politics. And in many cases, what will happen is that you may have go into Washington, D.C., you may get 5 bankers or go into a congressional office on a Washington visit. And the credit unions will bring in 50 credit union officials. And the other things that bankers may want to look at is engaging their stockholders, or not stockholders, but actually their board members. Because they are, the board members are, they're people of influence. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the congressman may be more likely to listen to them than just to the public at large.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel like, oh, we were getting close, making some progress, maybe either in Congress with a particular bill or maybe in a particular state? Did you ever see anything that really gave you hope?
I thought occasionally, we had some progress. I think Utah back in 2003 made some progress in that front. They clearly tied the taxation to public education, that this money was going to go for funding schools. And so they did some progress. I don't think it ever got enacted, because one of the things that, but it was something that had some progress. That Iowa also has had some progress on the ground. At the federal level, I always thought tax reform was going, especially reforming the corporate tax code was going to be the silver bullet, but it ended up not happening back in 2017.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, you've been working on this issue a long time, as you mentioned. Tell me a little bit about how the blog got started. Was it your idea? Did someone else in your shop say, hey, we ought to do a blog? Or how did that get going?
Actually, I was approached about starting to write the blog. What occurred is I used to write a bi-weekly column in our publications at the American Bankers Association, but those publications went away. And somebody said, those columns that you wrote would fit in ideally into a blog environment. So that's when we launched it in 2009. And I was the first person at ABA to actually have a social media site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you got pretty good reaction. Obviously, you had a following.
Yeah, there was a good following. I actually had following from both bankers and also from credit union people. And a lot of the credit union people came to me because they thought that they're getting at least a more balanced presentation than the spin that they were getting from the credit union trade associations.
Uh-huh. And how about as you reflect back, is there one or two posts that you made that really stirred up a lot of response that you can remember?
Well, I think there are several. One, every year I did this compensation survey where I went through and pulled information from the 990s. That tended to get a big reaction. The other one was when I did a Freedom of Information Act request and got this white paper that NCOA did on reforming their insurance system. And that got a big reaction because nobody even knew about this. And I discovered it in a footnote in a congressional testimony and requested that information.
Yeah, well, it's that paying attention to the details often makes a difference. Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, that's great. Do you, and now you've kind of wrapped it up. I mean, it's kind of interesting. The blog started right after the crisis of 08, 09, and now you're kind of concluding in the midst of another significant crisis. Was that deliberate or why wrap it up now?
Well, I thought right now with the pandemic and the recession, it was a good time to step away. I think that you need to have both banks and credit unions working together to try to advance issues that benefit both industries, that help people. And it's not good to have somebody out there who is sticking his thumb in the eye of credit unions at this moment. And so I thought it was probably an ideal time to step away.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm glad that you took a little time here to share your thoughts about the blog. And if any viewers want to take a look at it, I understand it remains on the internet, and it is at creditunionwatch.blogspot.com. And I anticipate that will be there for indefinite future.
I think it's there for perpetuity. I don't know how or whatever happens to them, but it seems like they just stay there forever.
So I guess people can still leave comments on some of those posts if they want. So
yes, and I will post them.
Okay.
They come to me.
That's great. That's great. Well, Keith, thank you very much. This has been the bankbeat.biz Quick Takes video blog. I'm Tom Bankston, publisher of bankbeat.biz, and my guest has been Keith Leggett.